Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. A century ago came one of the darkest events in the history of the British Empire. The Jaliawala Bagh Massacre, also known as the Amritsar Massacre, took place on April the 13th, 1919. Troops of the British Indian Army, under the command of Colonel Reginald Dyer, opened fire into a crowd who had largely gathered to celebrate the Massacre festival. Official figures stated 379 people were killed and around 1,200 wounded. However, other estimates have claimed the death toll was far, far higher. Today, we are joined by author and political columnist Sourav Dutt, whose book, Garden of Bullets, Massacre at Jaliawala Bagh, examines the past and traces how the tragic event ignited India's freedom movement. Sourav, firstly, great to have you on the show today. First, I want to start with, the massacre was clearly a brutal, heartbreaking and tragic event. What inspired you to delve into history and write your book?
Sure, thank you very much for having me here today. It being the centenary, it's the perfect time to re-examine this extremely dark chapter of Indian history, which affected Sikhs, Hindus and Muslims in the Punjab area in Amritsar. And I just wanted to explore and take this story from a different perspective, to take an entirely scholarly approach, but to look at the humans, the emotions, the people involved, the families, loved ones who perished and survivors as well. And to look at things from multiple angles, to look at the colonial masters, their racist approach, their idea, their paranoia about what was happening in Punjab at the time, and to understand the freedom fighters, the approach of those who were in Amritsar and wanted independence for themselves. Also to understand the sepoys, the Sikh soldiers, the Gurkha soldiers. What were they thinking, for example? And so I was really wanted to approach this from multiple angles, to give tribute to what happened and to really talk about the gravity. Because sometimes when you only look at numbers and you're looking at things from a purely academic approach, you don't understand that these are lives that have been impacted. And it wasn't just about casting an eye back to the past, it was thinking about ramifications for now, for the future, because anyone of a British Indian or British Asian identity has been impacted by this. Your viewers, if they're from the Punjab, if they're Sikh, they will know someone who has been impacted by this in some measure. And if you've been to Jaliawala Bagh or the Golden Temple or been around Amritsar, this massacre casts a shadow across the entire province. And I just wanted to dig into that and pay tribute to that. It's really important future generations understand what happened. What can happen over time, sadly, as you can imagine, is that there's a revisionist stance towards history. People like to whitewash things, they offer different justifications. And if you don't talk about what happened properly and you sort of pay respect to the past, you cannot teach the people of the future, you cannot teach the students of the future who want to learn more. For most people, their reference is the film Gandhi, and that's a very old movie now. So that was my humble attempt to really cast light on the past and to hopefully inspire people to learn more about what happened then.
And through research, you've dedicated years of your life to this book and uncovered startling new evidence. Can you give us some of the standout pieces of evidence that you came across during your research?
Sure, my research took me, to Amritsar and back. It took me to looking into multiple volumes of information from multiple sides, actually, from whether the British Imperial angles and also speaking to descendants that I've been able to contact over many years in Amritsar, in India and around the world. And some of the sort of standout information I've just found is some of the startling racism, some of the fact that so many wounded were turned away from hospitals in the Amritsar area. We know that this was a factor in in the high casualty numbers. But some of the descendants I spoke to, their great-great-grandfathers, great-great-grandmothers succumbed to gangrene, to infections, because they were dragged away from the grounds, but they were too terrified to go to the hospital, just in case they and the rest of their family would be arrested because of guilt by association. So examples like that, also finding out about the ancestors of Dyer himself, and finding out that his great-great-great-granddaughter, for example, was completely oblivious to his dark history, and that his family has tried to wipe away what happened as much as conceivably possible, because they don't want him to be painted in a bad light. But people are still finding out today what happened. So I think those are just a few nuggets of sort of information I found out, and read the book and you'll find many more.
And you mentioned Colonel Dyer there.
Yeah.
When he gave the orders for the army to open fire, just before those moments, what do you think was going through his mind?
Well, we know what was going through his mind because of multiple accounts. We don't know which is the correct one. All we can do is talk about what he said most immediately after the fact and the angle he stuck by. In the morning, he had gone around 19 points in Amritsar to basically read out a proclamation to say, do not gather anywhere in numbers of a greater number to hold demonstrations of any kind. If you do, violence may ensue and there will be consequences. Interestingly, he wasn't from the Amritsar area, he didn't know it very well. This proclamation was not read out at the Golden Temple or Jaliawala Bagh, two of the major points in Amritsar, which is remarkable. But what he had on his mind was, if he approached the area and there was a congregation of substantial size, which is what he had been told was going to happen there, he was ready and willing to fire. He had taken 2 vehicles with mounted machine guns. They just couldn't get through the narrow alleyway. I don't know if you've been to Jaliawala Bagh, but the entrance is quite narrow. He couldn't fit those through, which frustrated him greatly. And when he walked through with his men, and he went through the entranceway and he saw 2 separate banks of earth, and he saw all the people there, he immediately knew that his order had been defied. He was enraged, furious that the natives had dared to defy his proclamation, and he felt sufficient warning had been given. So his initial feeling was to fire immediately, and this is exactly what he did. He didn't even look at to attend to the wounded afterwards. He immediately turned on his heels and left. We also know from testimony that he gave after the fact and in dispatches to his seniors that he really wanted to teach a lesson. He saw a lot of the Indians and the Sikhs as disobedient children, essentially, and it was his job to discipline them. And he felt that they were being essentially naughty children, constantly defying his orders and that of the British Empire and of the autocracy there. And he wanted to send out a harsh lesson. This was his opportunity. And that's really what I think was going through his mind. And he probably was horrified at the size of the crowds there. And interestingly, one of the first things he had said after the fact was that he felt in danger. He felt that the crowd could turn on him at any moment, and his men, and would easily swamp them. Interestingly, he only said this about once. He didn't stick to that line. Had he stuck to that line, we may be talking about him in different terms. But the fact is, he said after that he wanted to create a moral lesson, and this was the way to do it.
And with it being such an emotive and tragic piece of history, did you ever find yourself getting quite emotional throughout your years of research?
Absolutely. I mean, I was born in India actually, and when I was going through the evidence and I was going through all the different accounts, what struck me the most and what hurt me was the sort of callousness, the racism. It was really fierce. The people who were shot upon were seen as nothing less than troublemakers and animals. They didn't even deserve medical attention, and those that did receive medical attention were taken to hospitals. They were treated with such abandon and such, contempt that no one even wanted to see to their wounds. One particularly nasty character named Colonel Johnson even said, well, why don't you take the wounded to Gandhi? He'll take care of them. I mean, there was this callousness, this sort of lack of humanity and lack of ethics that was very upsetting to read about. But also it was upsetting to read about the general mindset of the British imperialists there. I mean, the fact is, most of the people who were agitating or doing political demonstrations at the time, all they wanted was some measure of political autonomy. They didn't want India to be completely removed from the empire. They just wanted to run their own affairs. It was dominion status they were asking for. Yet still, this incurred the wrath of the imperial mindset. So it was very upsetting to just see how, people weren't even being looked after the massacre at the Bagh itself. And the martial law that happened afterward is really upsetting. So what essentially happened was the lieutenant governor of the province, Sir Michael O'Dwyer, who was assassinated by Udham Singh, he basically installed retroactive martial law, which basically led to an amount of what were called fancy punishments. People were made to salute Europeans or be flogged. They were flogged at whipping posts. along a particular lane. They were forced to crawl on their stomachs, hands and knees, to go from one side to the other. Cars were corralled, you know, elderly statesmen and people of note, barristers, people like that, they were made to do menial tasks and treated as less than human. And seeing how this went on for months and months was extremely upsetting, because it showed that all those who lived in the Punjab were seen as nothing less than, you know, meat, basically.
And as well as the long-lasting effects on the community, or the Indian community in the area, do you think it's fair to say that the British Empire never really truly recovered from the massacre itself as well?
I mean, it's one of the darkest chapters of the era, and it's also the catalyst. After this point, my submission is that the veil was finally lifted from British imperialism. No more could anyone say, you know what, this is a benign, caring imperial enterprise, that they actually care about the natives, they actually want to do better for India. This was that time and that moment where it was very clear that they see you as nothing less than human, you know, that they would treat you with such contempt and such hatred. And this, you know, instigated a revolt and a mindset and a revolutionary spirit in the Punjab particularly, and in India, throughout India, that was not there before. The Gandhi Satyagraha movement took wings. It moved to a new level of obstinacy, of political involvement. And then there were the more militant movements, you know, the Bagh Singhs, for example, and the Udham Singhs, people who would no longer be treated as subhuman. They wanted to fight for revolution. Inqilab Zindabad, that's what they fought for, and that they wouldn't accept, you know, the limits that were put upon them. So this was the catalyst towards self-determination and independence. And we may not have seen that had the Jaliawala Bagh massacre had not happened. And the British at long last realized that, you know, we've gone too far with this. And all their actions subsequent to the massacre, you know, bear that out. I mean, Dyer was essentially shuffled away to England, but he was still treated as a hero. The Lieutenant Governor, O'Dwyer, still commended his action. And as the martial law punishment showed, no one was really sorry. Sepoys with their bayonets and their rifles were still whipping natives in the street, you know, and it was only through real agitation and taking some force and sometimes using violence that they could understand that the Indians no longer wanted to be self-governed by an external party.
And with it being such a, obviously a dark event in history, but something which some should never ever be forgotten about, why do you believe that so many people are simply unaware of what took place in 1919?
Well, that wouldn't be the case in India, because they've made a really painstaking effort to look back at the past, because of course it happened here. The issue is over in this country, in the Western Hemisphere, and it's just been, it's this revisionist policy. The whole event essentially has been whitewashed in a sense, because the narrative that's being painted over time, especially more so now, is that the Jaliawala Bagh massacre was a singular event. It was a one-off. It was this one horrible thing that happened in the empire, but the empire was actually quite great, actually. So that's the sort of narrative that's being painted, but that's not true. It's very typical of the colonial mindset. It fed in to the violence and the racism that was endemic during that entire time. So I think that's part of the problem within the educational system, and there's not many representations in media about this. Most of the films are Indian movies or Bollywood movies. They're not given perhaps as much release, and it's been many years. They're currently making a new film on Udham Singh now. Hopefully that will result in a bit more awareness, which is coming out next year, I believe. But I think that's the problem. They've placed the Jaliawala Bagh massacre within a nice compartment, which is, this was a horrible one-off, it was really terrible, but don't be mistaken in thinking that this represented the British Empire. But we know better. We know it was very typical of the colonial mindset and violence towards the natives.
And many people demanding an apology from the British government.
They are.
Obviously, Virendra Sharma is somewhat leading the charge in Parliament here, but obviously that apology is still yet to come, despite pressure year after year after year. Why has the British government not yet apologised, in your view?
Sure. Well, there's two ways to look at this. For some people, they would say, look, it's just an apology, it's words, we can't apologise to those who suffered, and therefore, you know, there's that argument about it being retrospective and having no meaning. And there's merit to that argument. My feeling is that an apology is an interesting assertion, but it can't be an apology alone. We need greater education, because if Theresa May or whoever apologises, as far as they're concerned, they can draw a line under the matter.
Yeah.
But we don't want that. We want future generations of British Indians, British Asians, and any student in this country to know what happened and what its context was all about. So an apology by itself in isolation doesn't do the job, really. And I think the fact that they don't want to apologise is they really don't want to call attention to their darkest moments.
Yeah.
Colonialism and imperialism is getting a kind of media resurgence now. It's got a great PR machine behind it, because people are now talking about the railways, the commerce. They're forgetting the concentration camps. They're forgetting the Bengal famine, Jaliawala Bagh massacre, because no one likes to call attention to the unsavoury or dark chapters of one's history. And I think that's the reason why there's not been an apology. But an apology alone isn't sufficient. We need greater education. And finally, some people think, look, we don't need an apology. It's an apology enough that Britain has to go to India with cap in hand asking for trade deals. And in a way, you know, the tail is now wagging the dog. And for them, that's an apology enough. If we look back at what's happened very recently, Sadiq Khan essentially apologised when he went there. David Cameron called it a shameful chapter and shameful incident, and the Queen even went with Prince Philip. But by way of a really quick anecdote, when Prince Philip went, he questioned the number who had been killed. And if he's even doing that in 1997, then we know we have a long way to go in terms of talking about the facts and talking about what actually happened. Because, as I said, there are many Punjabis, many Sikhs here whose ancestors have been impacted by this, and they care. People who are younger than us want to know what their great-grandfathers experienced and their grandfathers experienced. And whether it's partition or whether it's Jaliawala Bagh massacre, we deserve to know all the full facts and to be told in a frank manner.
And obviously huge importance, as you say, to educate people about this incident and not just apologise, even though that is obviously a crucial aspect as well. Are you confident in the next 10 to 20 years, perhaps, that following continued pressure, the government will actually get this on the curriculum? The Jaliawala Bagh massacre will be taught to children, taught to youngsters in schools across the UK?
I think, you know, we're living in an extremely, you know, multi-ethnic society now. We're living in a society that is diverse. And if we want an education system that's representative of them, then I think the education system has to talk about these incidents. You know, acknowledging slavery, acknowledging, you know, the issue of reparations, acknowledging things of that nature, the Bengal famine, you know, Churchill's racism, for example, and the Jaliawala Bagh massacre within its full context. We have more Sikh MPs in Parliament now, we have more people lobbying, and there's an argument to be made. You know, enough time has passed for us to be able to look back at this incident and understand just how horrific and horrible it was. So I think, you know, I'm confident that over time, certainly within the next 10 years, we will have a greater reframing of this element of history. And that this centenary, you know, we're not done yet. As this goes to air, the 13th of April is still to come. Who knows what will be said at that time? You know, and when we get to, for example, the 75th year of partition happening, maybe there'll be a more greater realisation of what the trauma that the British Empire inflicted upon the Indian subcontinent.
And I mean, to this day, do you believe due to the massacre there's still somewhat of a underlying fragmentation between the relations between the British and Indian people, or is not that something which you believe is the case?
Well, I would like to believe that, but actually it's probably not the case, because if you do go to India and you talk about this subject quite a bit, you'd be surprised. A lot of people feel that some of the words that have been spoken thus far have been sufficient. A lot of people were happy with what David Cameron said, and his words were quite far-reaching. But at the same time, they were still couched in the whole narrative of it was a horrible one-off and we regret it. But then again, no one's going to really apologise for colonial history and colonial rule. I don't see that ever happening. But yeah, I don't think there's as much of an appetite within India to get that apology. But they would like to know that, you know, that episode is given the attention and care that it deserves. You know, whether it's talking about something more modern or about 1984 or something like that, you know, they just want to know that it's being acknowledged. But I think an outright apology is probably not what the Indian government and populace really want. So at the time of the Jaliawala Bagh massacre happened, there was a draconian piece of legislation called the Rowlatt Act, which led to rounding up of of Sikh Punjabis and Muslims on no grounds of evidence, given to trial and essentially deported. And the great-grandson of the judge who enacted that is actually a BBC reporter. And he said when he goes to Delhi, people know who he is, but they don't treat him with contempt. And I think that's quite telling, because we shouldn't, hate current generations for that. But what I do find unacceptable is historical ignorance or sort of historical naivety. And that's what we have to combat, because it's not sufficient if in 20 years' time our children turn to us and say, what was the Jaliawala Bagh massacre? Never heard of it.
And with the centenary just days away now, is there a fear that, due to obviously Brexit simply dominating the news agenda, dominating the political agenda, that we could actually lose sight of the massacre when the centenary day actually does come? Yeah,
I mean, there's an argument for that. What I would say is that there are initiatives that are happening. For example, in the House of Lords, what they're actually doing through the Lumba Foundation is they are bringing exhibits from the Partition Museum in Amritsar to London, to Manchester, to Birmingham. They're going on a tour. And the sort of stuff they're showing parts of the wall of the Jaliawala Bagh that have bullets in them, holes in them still. A whipping post. They're actually bringing a real whipping post where natives were strung up, take all their clothes taken off and whipped in the street. And it's important that people get to see these in person to understand what was really involved. So there are initiatives. There's the Asian Awards, which I'm a part of as well, where we're actually giving a fellowship award on behalf of all of those who were slain to a living descendant. So there are measures that are being taken. My book, as well as other books, are being released. We hope more and more people will read these over time, and that even if the 13th of April goes by, that people understand and enrich their knowledge. And I think that's a success.
And your research, as you mentioned before, took you to Amritsar and back. If you had to single out 2 or 3 particular things throughout your years of research, what would you say have been the most memorable aspects of that?
I think understanding the history of what happened to Dwyer after the fact. He never really regretted his actions, but he was a broken man, racked by ill health, and deep in his heart, his black heart, it affected him greatly. He died not too long after the events themselves. He was riven by strokes, he retired to a countryside, and his family tried to shut down his history. I found that really interesting. In Bristol, you can still find the cottage where he breathed his last. And his wife at the time, his children, they all tried to shut away evidence of his military history because they didn't want his descendants to know what a horrible reputation he had. At the same time, it's been really empowering to understand more about Udham Singh and those within revolutionary movements who took inspiration from what happened to launch their own campaigns. That was really powerful. And some of the accounts of survivors, people like Ratan Devi, these are the most chilling stories that they had. They stayed there during the entire night with bodies all around them, people dying, breathing their last, and still people looked over their dead, begging for help, crying into the skies because there was a curfew. They couldn't just get up and just leave and do whatever they wanted to do. And they had to stay there that entire night. And then as daylight came, you saw the Jaliawala Bagh and there were thousands upon thousands of bodies. I mean, such horrific sights. And these things have stayed with me.
Of course. And the book's out of the way now. In a nutshell, what does the next 6 to 8 weeks hold for you?
Hopefully I can talk about what happened as much as possible, offer multiple sort of viewpoints, talk about the paranoia of the British, talk about what the sepoys and the Sikh soldiers were feeling when they were in the ranks. Imagine what they were thinking when they fired upon their own countrymen. To talk about the survivors, to talk about Udham Singh, Bhagat Singh, for example. And, that's what I'm going to be about. It's about knowledge. I wrote this book to enrich knowledge, to hopefully get someone who's 15, 16, who wants to understand when they next go to Amritsar or the Punjab, when they walk into those grounds, that they understand exactly what happened there. So that's for me. I'm on a quest to sort of enrich and to provide knowledge.
And where can people get your book now?
So Amazon is probably the first place to go, but it'll be in Waterstones, W.H. Smith and Barnes & Noble. But Amazon is the first place. You can pick up your copy today.
Thanks, Surav. That's been very, very insightful. Really appreciate you coming onto the show today. And thank you everyone for watching. That's all for today. Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh.